Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, just days after voting out, a divided Britain comes face to face with the harsh realities of Brexit. What happens next, and is a U-turn possible? And weeks away from a ruling on the South China Sea arbitration case filed by the Philippines, China holds firm to its stance not to participate. Should the solutions lie in international law? And we start today's show with Brexit. Since the end of the EU referendum last week, the UK has been making headlines worldwide all the time. From the planning to resignate of the Prime Minister of the UK to more division, from petitions for a second referendum to a downgraded rating status, the uncertainty brought by the Leave vote has brought about great anxiety for the British people, both pro-EU voters and anti-EU campaigners alike. We will talk about the internal instability in the nation later, but first, let's take a look at this.
A common rainy day in London, somewhat different in the post-referendum period. Many Brits are anxious. In the last 5 days, everything has changed dramatically. First, their Prime Minister announced he would resign by October.
A negotiation with the European Union will need to begin under a new Prime Minister. And I think it's right that this new Prime Minister takes the decision about when to trigger Article 50 and start the formal and legal process of leaving the EU.
While who might replace Cameron remains unknown, the opposition Labour Party is divided, with its leader Jeremy Corbyn being asked to resign for what was seen as a half-hearted effort to campaign in favour of EU. But he has his supporters and refuses to give in.
Don't let those people who wish us ill divide us. Stay together, strong and united for the kind of world we want to live in.
In Scotland, the devolved government there is already preparing to call for a second referendum for independence from Britain, based on the fact that the majority of Scottish people had voted against the Brexit. That's not all. Nearly 4 million UK residents have signed a petition calling for a second referendum, signalling possible regret.
We would vote differently because obviously the facts are coming in now and our eyes actually woken. If in other sense it's actually been open of actually seeing what's happening.
Ratings agency Standard & Poor downgraded UK's rating status by 2 notches with a negative outlook. Analysts say in the coming weeks the nation will see volatility and even recession. The deal, however, will not be finished in 2 years. It could take years afterwards before an EU-free UK fully recovers and stands to its feet.
For more discussion on this, we are joined by 3 panelists. Firstly, from Beijing, we have Mr. Cui Hongjian, Director of the European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir, to our program. Also joining us here, we are having Mr. John Ross, a Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China, originally from the city of London. And we're also joined in London, Ian Beck, a Research Fellow in the European Institute at the London School of Economics. He is also an Associate Fellow at the Chatham House. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Things are getting so complicated, gentlemen. I have to admit, even as a journalist, I'm trying to keep up, but I really cannot keep up with all of the latest developments. So maybe you guys are much wiser than I am. Let me throw to you the very first question. John, here in Beijing. What's going to happen to the Conservative Party, the party that is now still running the country? The Prime Minister said he plans to resign, did not necessarily give a specific date. And from now until, I don't even know how to ask this question, the next cabinet is being formed, what is likely to happen? John?
Well, fundamentally, from the point of relations with the EU, nothing is going to happen, because the first thing that Cameron said in his resignation is he will not apply for Article 50. Just so you understand technically, the only way that Britain can leave the European Union is it has to apply under Article 50 of the European Union Treaty and say it wants to leave. But the government doesn't want to do this because Article 50 says that you only have 2 years to negotiate. And if you haven't completed the negotiation, then everything goes. It means you have no free trade, you have no licenses for the British Union. So therefore the first thing that the people who wanted to leave said, rather paradoxically, is that they're not going to apply immediately under under Article 50. So I think there will be a new Conservative Prime Minister. They've announced on the 2nd of September, but until then nothing really will happen on the question of the European Union, because the European Union said it will not negotiate until Article 50 is invoked.
Okay, we have to make sure we understand all the different categories of issues. One, of course, is the relations between the UK and the European Union. And the other is what we are talking about specifically, even more, is the internal politics inside the UK. About the internal politics inside the UK, Mr. Bagger, do you agree with what John just said here in Beijing? And meanwhile, what is going to be the competition among the possible candidates of the Conservative Party while the Prime Minister is still in the office? Ian.
Well, the first thing to explain is the process inside the Conservative Party, which is that the members of Parliament will try to select two candidates, and those two candidates will be presented to all party members. That's why it takes a bit of time. They have to engage in what we call hustings, where candidates present themselves to the electorate. They're trying to accelerate this as much as possible because there's great pressure coming from the rest of Europe to say, well, you voted to leave, get on with it. Don't hang around, because the uncertainty of the delay is bad for both sides. So there is going to be, at least by Conservative Party standards, quite an accelerated timetable over the summer to select a new leader. Now what Cameron said is it's really up to that new leader, whoever he or quite possibly she is, to engage in the negotiations, and this is the famous Article 50 that John's just been talking about.
All right, Ian, since you're already
I
talking...
suspect that David...
Since you're already talking about the two candidates, so let me talk about the two candidates. I try to keep up with all the names, the political figures. Of course, one is very familiar, Boris Johnson, who is the leader of the Leave camp, even though he's also belonging to the Conservative Party. And the other is what some media reports would suggest as England's Angela Merkel, of course, as a female candidate. Quite neutral, I would say, over the past few months leading to the referendum vote on to leave or to remain. So what do you make of these two candidates' possibilities? Will the party come up with some new ones?
Well, it's possible, because there are several other senior members of the Conservative Party who at the moment are trying to put themselves in the shop window to say, what do you think of me? They're trying to form alliances with members of Parliament. So there will be that jockeying for position going on. But at the moment, you're right. It's your friend Boris Johnson, and Chinese viewers will remember him from his parades in the Olympics in 2008, and this Interior Minister, what we call the Home Secretary here, Theresa May, who had a very quiet campaign. She didn't expose herself very much to one side or the other, and now people are saying, well, she's been very clever because she wants to take over the leadership.
And what would that mean to China, Mr. Cui? I mean, all of us are watching what is going on in London, and as we said, it's dramatic, it's so fast, like the lightning. Every second there's something coming out. What does that mean to us? China's deal with the UK, China's investment in the UK,
yes.
The previous, or shall I say, the current administration still in the Westminster, all the negotiations between Beijing and London.
Yes, certainly. I think that on this issue, China should not be an observer just from outside, from a distant place. I think now from China's side, we take a very, very deep concern what's the situation, including you mentioned that how is new cabinet for Conservative Party. I think that no matter he or she will take the position of the Prime Minister, the first thing for the new cabinet, for the new government, is to show the very, very strong message to the outside, say that we will keep the continuity.
Well, you probably would hope so. Whether that is going to be the case or not is still another big question mark. But having said that, though, John, I want to come back to you. Confident about September the 2nd, as if that could be a set date. A new cabinet can be formed after the Prime Minister resigns, but still we do not know whether there's going to be a general election inside the UK in which both parties, candidates can participate, or there's just going to be a substitute for the current Prime Minister coming from his own Conservative Party. So what is your way on that two possibilities?
I think there will be the announcement today. There'll be a new Tory leader by the 2nd of September. Whether they call a general election depends what the opinion polls say. What time's opinion polls? As we all know, time really could make a huge difference, John. Well, and also the polls are inaccurate at the moment on most things, so therefore it's even more risky. But the key question is that the next Prime Minister will not want to be involved in to go to the electorate with the negotiations in the EU, because the Leave camp told completely utopian view about the terms which we got for leaving the European Union. It will rapidly become apparent in any negotiations with the EU that their claims are totally unrealistic. That means that the support for the position taken by the Conservative Party will fall. Therefore, if a Conservative Prime Minister remains in office during the negotiations, there is a very big risk that their popularity will fall. They may face a revolt in the House of Commons, they may lose a general election. The temptation, therefore, is to call a quick general election before the negotiations take place in the hope you'll win it. The risk is that if the Tory party does not have a majority in the House of Commons, there is no majority in the House of Commons for leaving. And you must be clear that the referendum has no legally binding status. Under the British Constitution, Parliament is supreme. The only body that can take Britain out of the European Union is Parliament, and if the Parliament returns a majority who are against withdrawal, well then it's not necessarily legally compelled to withdraw at all. So it is a very big risk, and that is the real unknown, I think. Not when there will be the new Tory party leader, but whether there will be a general election or not.
What do you think, Ian? I'm already having some dizzy head while John is trying so hard to explain to me the internal politics. But what do you think about these two possibilities? A inside the party decision or general election?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. What will happen first is that a new Prime Minister will be appointed. It will then depend on the dynamics inside both the Conservative Party and inside the British Parliament, whether it becomes worth going then to a general election where there's a possibility of an entirely new shape of government emerging. It may be right-wing, it may be a coalition, it may be something different. So we really don't know. So if you think you're confused, you can imagine what it's like for us in London. We don't understand anything that's going on.
I feel much more comfortable.
But what is certain in this is that there is going to be a very strong political commitment, because although John is correct to say that the referendum has no legal status, it has absolute political status. The people have spoken. The people may be idiots, but they have spoken, and this is the concern we have. It will be very hard for any political process to overturn what the people have said in the referendum, unless there's a move towards a new referendum, because there's a sense that we've been deceived in the way this has been conducted. Now that's what's now appearing on the agenda without certainty about where it goes next. I'm reminded here of something that Vladimir Lenin said, which is there are some decades where nothing happens and some weeks where decades happen.
Wow, that's a wonderful quote. I always love those. But may I just follow up by asking you two minor questions, Ian, because you were talking about earlier about the Parliament's decision or feeling after the new Prime Minister, after September the 10th, the 2nd coming into the office. But when you look at the House of Commons, which is making a huge difference in terms of political decisions, most are still the Conservative Party. So will the Conservative Party making a decision to vote itself out, mainly to have another general election? Well, will that necessarily be the logic?
Well, it depends how they read what's going on in the Labour Party, which is currently melting down. All the support for Jeremy Corbyn is evaporating this week, with something like 2/3 of his internal shadow cabinet, that's the opposition to the government, just saying, no, we cannot work with you, we don't think you can win anything. That meltdown means that the Conservatives, by default, are relatively stronger, even though they are divided.
Right.
So it's a very confused picture at the moment that we're all trying to make sense of.
Okay, Ian, another follow-up question about the possibility of any new referendum. How big really is there? Even though we have learned through the news report, there are different kinds of petitions going on inside the UK about having another referendum. But really, for a nationwide one, the fourth in its history?
Well, it would depend on whether there is a sufficient popular movement to say the last referendum was badly conducted, people didn't vote for the right reasons, they were misled, some of the things that John was talking about just now. If there's a big momentum behind that, and already we have 4 million signatures for this petition, then that too can become a political fact which others cannot ignore. Now, one of the great ironies of this petition is that it was actually launched by a supporter of the Leave campaign.
That's right.
He started it a few months ago, expecting that what would happen is that there would be a Remain vote, and he could then cry foul, this wasn't conducted in an appropriate manner. So it's one of the great ironies that this huge Leave initiative has become a Remain campaign.
Well, politics is only getting ever more complicated and sometimes even fun from certain angles, but chaos most of the time. John, we talk about mainly the Conservative Party. Of course, there is the opposition party, which is the Labour Party. Ian already talked about a totally shattered politics of the opposition party of Mr. Corbyn. But on the other hand, we've seen different discussions within the opposition party itself as well. So what would that mean?
Well, that's tied to the referendum question, because the question is what actually will take it. I think the chance of having a second referendum, because a lot of people want it, is zero. But there is a different question. Will you have a referendum on the eventual terms which are negotiated with the EU? Which is not a second referendum on the existing question. It's a question, there are now real terms. What are you going to vote on this? Are you going to vote on this? That's a very logical position. People like Jeremy Hunt, who's actually in the Tory party, have already said this, and Lord Butler, who's former head of the civil service. If Labour takes that, that will have an important effect. The question of Jeremy Corbyn is just a question that is what the Labour Party members think. It doesn't matter a slightest bit from the point of view of his position of the Labour Party, whether the shadow cabinet, every single person except himself resigned. He has the complete right to appoint the shadow cabinet. And the leader of the Labour Party is elected by the members of the Labour Party. So the only real relevant question is whether the Labour Party members will re-elect him or not. As I'm pretty sure that there will be a leadership contest, we will find out.
Everything is shattered politically inside the UK. Everything become a changeable possibility.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, one of the biggest possibility is, or uncertainty, shall I say, is about when the EU would withdraw, or rather, the UK would withdraw from the EU. About the process of UK withdrawing from the EU, legal experts say it will be a long and complex one. After UK votes leave, the government will need to formally notify the EU to invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, as we mentioned earlier, which will be the first in history. And the remaining 27 members will meet and discuss. Then negotiations begin. A draft deal of UK's withdrawal needs to be approved by at least 20 EU members, with over 65% of the total population before being ratified by the European Parliament. This process needs to be done within 2 years from now on, and any extension must be agreed by all 27 other members of the EU so far. Next, if there is no need to extend the negotiations, all EU treaty cease to apply to the UK, and the UK will formally be out of the EU. That, of course, is supposed to be the rules, but at this moment, Mr. Cui, we are seeing something very different, that the EU members and the EU leaders as a whole, together with some of the strongest economies of the EU, refuse even talk to London and say, if you want to go as quickly as you can. Yeah. We don't want to talk to you. We don't want to negotiate with you. We're not here for a better deal for you. Mr. Cui, what's going on here?
Yes, I think that firstly, for most of the European Union member states, including those leaders, this result of a referendum was out of their expectation. Frankly, there was not a plan B from a European Union side to this result. Secondly, of course, now the challenge to European Union is how to, to deal with this issue, especially how about the domino effect from this referendum to other member states. So now it looks like there will be a consensus from other member states of the European Union say that we need to have this process of negotiation as soon as possible, and we need to finish it also as soon as possible.
But they probably don't even want to negotiate with the UK. They just want the UK out as soon as possible. No deals for you. But Ian, what does that mean? When you have a 2-year supposed to be legal process, and yet the reality is nobody wants to talk to London.
No, that's not correct.
That's not correct?
That,
okay.
It's in the interests of both. It's in the interests of both sides to work out, as in any divorce, who gets the children, who gets the CDs, who keeps the car, because that's what it's really about.
Oh my God.
It's trying to disentangle complicated, a very complicated relationship. Now, even a few years ago, we talked about joining the EU, involving 80,000 pieces of legislation, what's called the acquis communautaire, the acquired rights of the European community. To go backwards in that means you have to undo 80,000, except it's now more than 80,000. So you have to work out what happens with the European budget, for example. What happens to the competition policy?
Yeah.
What are the new trade rules that apply? How you deal with the judicial cooperation across borders? All of these things you need to separate. And that's just the divorce negotiations, because then you have to reach a new agreement on the future relationship between the former spouses.
All right.
So there's two things here. The divorce negotiations, which is the 2 years of Article 50, and there's also in parallel supposed to be an invention of the new model for linking the two entities, the UK and the EU.
I see. John, we only have 20 seconds left for you, so anything to add?
Well, the key question for me will be whether there's a referendum on the final terms for Brexit. I think it's very possible if there is a referendum on the actual terms of Brexit, it'll be thrown out and Britain would remain a member of the EU.
All right. When the marriage itself, the EU, is already an experiment, of course the divorce will be another big one. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're just have to wait and see what's going to happen later. But thank you so much for the three of you's insights. Help us understand much better what is going on right now in the UK and beyond. Cui Hongjian, John Ross, Ian Beck, really appreciate gentlemen for being with us. All the best, of course, to the people in the UK. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. While the Philippines wait on The Hague for a verdict on the South China Sea arbitration case, China's stance not to participate remains unchanged. Does this go hand in hand with international law? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We are approaching the end of June, and in the coming weeks, an arbitral tribunal is set to pass a final judgment on an arbitration case unilaterally initiated by the Philippines on the South China Sea dispute. The Chinese government has reiterated its non-acceptance and non-participation stance in the case. Take a look at this.
China visits Vietnam. Chinese State Councillor Yang Jiechi met Vietnamese President Tran Dai Quang and Communist Chief Nguyen Phu Trong in Hanoi on Monday. As the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague is expected to issue a ruling in a case filed by the Philippines contesting Beijing's claims to the South China Sea. The Chinese government has reiterated its non-acceptance and non-participation stance in the case. It also refuted Western media reports that only few states offered support for its refusal to recognize the case.
We hope that the relevant media outlets can report in an impartial and objective way to China.
In 2013, the Philippines filed a compulsory arbitration against China with respect to the two sides' disputes in the South China Sea. The tribunal is formed under aegis of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. UNCLOS provides a compulsory and binding framework for the peaceful settlement of disputes. But there are limitations. Experts say sovereignty dispute is under the customary international law, which requires a different arrangement.
First of all, territorial issues are beyond the scope of the UNCLOS. Secondly, China has excluded maritime delimitation from compulsory arbitration in declaration in accordance with Article 298 of the UNCLOS.
China and the Philippines have agreed to settle their disputes in the South China Sea through friendly consultations and negotiation. This would deprive the tribunal of jurisdiction over the dispute.
And in fact, there are a couple of documents that were presented to the tribunal, which the tribunal considered, that seemed to point in that direction. But the way the tribunal dealt with them, in my view, was slightly unsatisfactory.
As we wait for results from the arbitration, countries continue to voice they would not back the arbitration court's upcoming decision over the South China Sea issue, with some believing that intervention from outside parties would only worsen the already tense situation.
For more on this, we're joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Liao Shiping, who is Associate Professor of Beijing Normal University Law School. Welcome to our program. Meanwhile, joining us from The Hague, we have invited Professor Kun Chengfu, Dean of Xiamen University South China Sea Institute, and also he's the Editor-in-Chief of China Oceans Law Review. Welcome to both of you, professors. First of all, why does China neither accept the arbitration, nor does China want to participate in the arbitration, if it is such an important issue for China, Professor Fu?
Yeah, I've been kept to ask this same question. People were wondering why China refused to accept this procedure, while we are insisting that we have many legal reasons to support our positions. The reason is very simple. In UNCLOS, that is United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, Article 298 created a backdoor for any contracting party states of the world to try to avoid any disputes concerning the following factors. One is maritime boundary delimitation. The other is territorial sovereignty. Thirdly, military confrontation. And lastly, fourthly, the historic titles. Or any of these four factors involved in any of the disputes concerning interpretation or practice of UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, can be avoided by any of the contracting party not to accept the compulsory jurisdiction. Because these disputes with these factors are so sensitive, experience has told us that this kind of compulsory jurisdiction involving a third-party adjudication procedures will not resolve the issue.
But
on the contrary, it will usually bring up more troubles, more confrontations.
But you know, Professor Liao here in Beijing, if China doesn't want to accept, if China doesn't want to participate, some would say it doesn't matter. Well, the court is already coming up with the decision, and therefore the rest of the world is going to accept that. So whether China accepts it or not does not matter to the others. And they are already putting China on the negative side by not accepting the final result. Professor?
Yes, I understand your concerns, but actually speaking, I think it is quite important for the Chinese government, both from the government way or from the academic way, to make the clarification that do not participate or do not accept tribunal's awards does not constitute such kind of violation of the contemporary rules of international law. According to the Annex 7 of the United Nations of the Law of the Sea, they have already provided the procedural guarantee for the parties which choose not to present themselves before the tribunal, which means to be default of the rules is quite consistent with the contemporary international law.
But Professor Fu, if that is the case, then should there be a platform on which some kinds of so-called justice can be stated or can be decided? Because after all, there are weaker parties, there are stronger parties in any kinds of dispute. Without accepting a third-party decision or a suggestion, does it mean the stronger party could always have a say about anything related to a dispute between a stronger party and a weaker party? Professor?
No, it's quite different, you know. In the first place, if China is not involved, not taking part in this procedure, we don't have to pay. We don't have to use our taxpayers' money to pay for the arbitrators, to pay for the clerks, and all the procedural costs. Filipinos are paying their own cost. That is number one important. Number two, that without our involvement, or in other cases, for example, between Dutch and the Russian people, if the Russians refuse to take part in the procedures, the legitimacy of the tribunal will be challenged, because any litigation, or in this case not litigation but a semi-judicial arbitrational procedure, takes two parties to be there. And it is not proper for this tribunal to manage a case which he does not enjoy jurisdiction in the first place, and then manage all those disputes objected by the UNCLOS itself. So the unilateral arrangements and management of this case is a failure. It's doomed.
But on the other hand, Professor Wu, help us to understand, if that is doomed, any other specific legal pieces or framework or mechanism that could help both China, the Philippines, and the rest of the world to understand better what's going on, and also to seek a solution, if not soon, at least in the near future, a solution?
Negotiation, diplomatic talks. You know, that has always been number one vehicles or ways and means for the various countries in the world to settle their dispute. Check your international textbook. Among all these 5 usually applicable methods, negotiation is always number one. Particularly like the framers, that means all the majority countries of the world, when we made the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, we all agreed that for these 4 types of sensitive factors in the disputes concerning the interpretation or practice of the convention, we should avoid any compulsory procedures.
I see. Very interesting over there. There are some specific legal frameworks and documents that we can refer to under the current framework. Let me give some of the examples to our audience, and we'll let both of you to comment about it. China and the Philippines, along with some of the other ASEAN members, also signed the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, or commonly known as the DOC, back in the year 2002. According to this document, take a look at this. Disputes over territories should be addressed through friendly negotiations in a peaceful manner by countries directly concerned. Resolving disputes through international arbitration was ruled out by both countries. That is according to that specific legal document. Okay, but the thing is, sometimes, Professor Fu, if I could come back to you once again, legal documents contradict one another. That is a commonplace on many issues around the world. So how should we say one legal document or one mechanism, such as those, the arbitration court, and those that we mentioned earlier of the DOC, they have contracting or contradictory points on how to solve disputes? Then, which piece shall we rely on? Or should we just have different countries embrace different kinds of documents for their own benefits?
In this case in front of us, there's no contradictory at all, because there's only one document which is an agreed preparation or agreement for all the various parties in the South China Sea region to settle our disputes. That is by friendly negotiation. And
you just mentioned an example in which there seems to be not much disputes. Rather, it's an agreement between two entities, whether it's a province of China or between two countries. So, but we are talking about disputes. That's why the laws are important, right?
Any agreement might bring up disputes, any agreement. So these so-called agreements, like the convention, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea is also an agreement. This agreement, when you interpret and practice it, will usually bring up disputes.
Go ahead, Professor Liao here in Beijing.
Yes, I will try to make the conversation a little bit clearer, which means that someone argues that the DOC is is only a political statement and bears no legal binding force. Therefore, in my opinion, according to the contemporary rules of international law, to determine the legal binding force of such kind of international instrument, we should look into the common intentions reflected by the treaty language or document language. So the DOC does require all the disputing parties, all the signature parties, to settle their disputes through the consultations and negotiations without any reference to the arbitration proceedings or other judicial method in order to settle the disputes in the present case. So that is why I also think that there exists no contradiction in the present case.
Same result reached through different means, it seems that both professor. That is one important point. That is why China does not want to participate about the process and the result about the arbitration. The other thing that's very important is where does it come from? I mean, China was suggesting the dotted line. What are the legal basis of the so-called dotted line proposed by China, and why should other parties accept those what China considered as the dotted line? Professor Liao here in Beijing, you might want to help us to understand a little bit better about that.
Yeah, I think from the legal perspective, we know that Philippines claims that whether the Chinese current dotted line is consistent or not with the United Nations on the law of the sea. But actually speaking, the legal basis of the dotted line lies not only related to the United Nations of law of the sea, but also related to the so-called general international law, which has already existed for many years.
Exactly what you are referring to.
Yes, the general rules of international law refers to a particular legal resources of contemporary rules of international law, which could be established outside the realm of the current United Nations of the law of the sea.
But once again, others would argue who don't agree with you, Professor Fu, would say, well, you can just go around the world and look for whatever legal document that is in your advantage and take full advantage of it, and therefore stating the kinds of dotted lines that China wants. What exactly is it?
The question about where to find the documentary support of our U-shaped line in South China Sea is a misleading question, because in in United Nations, whenever we talk about international law, we are talking about mainly customary international law and statutory international law. And customary international has always been even more usual than statutory international law. In the South China Sea, the U-shaped line, which is definitely not a dotted line because it was drawn with sections. It used to be at the beginning 11 sections, then later on in early 1950s, 9 sections. Recently, 2 years ago, it was drawn by Chinese government as 10 sections. Anyway, so the section line, and for each section, it was drawn exactly as a national boundary line on land, meaning it's drawn like dash, parenthesis, dot, dash, parenthesis, dot, dash, parenthesis, dot. At that time in 1940s and 50s, always on land, we have many different unsettled land boundary line with our neighboring countries. We have unsettled boundary line with Korea, with Russia, with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and Vietnam.
I see.
In the previous decades, most of these were already decided through bilateral negotiation. On this maritime boundary line, we draw it as a U-shaped line, and it's sectioned, discontinued, meaning it is like on land, it is a not yet finalized maritime boundary line. And also notice this, the line was drawn roughly at the middle part of the water area between Chinese small islands and other countries' continents or large islands.
I see.
Meaning it's a very reasonable working line for future maritime boundary delimitation efforts.
Okay.
Also, legally speaking, it's an invitation to negotiate, invitation to offer.
Okay, what about you, Mr. Liao?
And I think it should be noted that the United Nations on the Law of the Sea has adopted on the 1982. But what we are talking about the dotted line, which has already mapped in the Chinese official maps in 1947, I think. So even the UNCLOS itself has recognized that it is, maybe sometimes it is not appropriate applicable law with regards to the dispute settlement on occasions something happened before the adoption of the UNCLOS. Yes.
I see. So it's a lot of times that we need to look at. It's not just the document itself, but rather under what circumstances, by what time those documents came into being, and how those are being compared to some of the historical facts we've already got before the documents came into being. Very interesting topic. Before we go, I want to have very briefly from both of you your views on this kinds of arbitration. What if the arbitration came out? And what this arbitration might have an impact on future arbitrations and also the future international conventions, whether on the sea or other issues. And also, will China set a precedence regarding the not taking part and not taking part in the process of the arbitration? Let's have you first, Professor Liao here in Beijing.
Yes, to be honest, it is not China who first initiated this kind of practice for not participating in the arbitration procedure. It is not the first time happened to China, I think.
All right.
But in another point, I think the decision made by the tribunal will create a real dangerous precedent in the international dispute settlement, since it to some extent encouraged all the signature parties of UNCLOS to make the disguised claims before the tribunal and be blinding to the declarations they have already referred.
I see. Professor Fu, very briefly, 10 seconds if you can.
Yeah, it's really difficult to briefly answer all these 4 or 5 questions you just brought up.
Yes,
but
indeed.
Briefly speaking, this is an initiation taken by the Philippines to try to make political propaganda. It is not a really legally minded, oriented action taken by the Manila government.
All right. Professor Kwon Cheng-fu and also Associate Professor Liao Shiping for being with us. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us and also help us to understand your perspective and your legal insights. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From Yi Tianwei and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.